Ever grown sweet potatoes only to dig them up and find tiny little tubers buried under a jungle of beautiful green vines? You are not alone. This is one of the most common frustrations gardeners face with sweet potatoes, and the good news is it is completely fixable. In this video, I am going to walk you through the entire process of growing sweet potatoes that actually produce big, beautiful tubers instead of just leaves. We are going to cover everything from selecting your slips to harvesting at the perfect time. Plus, stick around to the end, because I have got a bonus tip for you on how to make your sweet potatoes taste dramatically sweeter, and it has nothing to do with how you grow them. Let's get into it. Sweet potatoes are one of the most rewarding crops you can grow in your garden. They are surprisingly easy once you understand what they actually need. And what they need is often the opposite of what most gardeners give them. Once you get this right, you will be pulling out sweet potatoes the size of your forearm. So let's start by understanding why sweet potatoes make leaves instead of tubers in the first place. Here's the thing most people do not realize about sweet potatoes. The plant does not actually care about making tubers. What it cares about is survival and reproduction. When a sweet potato plant is living the good life with plenty of nitrogen, plenty of water, and rich, fertile soil, it thinks everything is wonderful, and it puts all of its energy into growing big, beautiful vines and leaves. Why would it bother storing energy underground when life is so easy up top? It is only when the plant experiences a little bit of stress, specifically low nitrogen and slightly dry conditions, that it starts thinking about the future. That is when it starts packing energy into those underground tubers as a survival mechanism. So our job as gardeners is to create the right kind of stress. Not so much that the plant struggles, but just enough that it shifts its energy from leaf production to tuber production. Keep that concept in mind because it is going to influence every step we take from here on out. Now let's talk about selecting and starting your slips. A slip is basically a sprout that grows off of a sweet potato, and that is what you plant in the ground. You can buy slips from garden centers or online, or you can grow your own from a sweet potato you already have. If you are buying slips, look for ones that are healthy, green, and about 6 to 8 inches long with a good set of leaves and some visible roots at the base. Avoid anything that looks wilted or yellowed. Now, if you want to grow your own slips, and I do this every year because it saves money and you get way more plants, here is how to do it. Take a healthy organic sweet potato because conventional ones are often treated with sprout inhibitors and suspend it in a jar of water with about 1/3 of the potato submerged. You can use toothpicks to hold it in place. Put that jar in a warm spot with plenty of light, and in about 2 to 4 weeks you will start seeing little sprouts emerging from the top. Those sprouts will grow into slips. Once a slip is about 6 inches long with roots forming at the base, you can gently twist it off the potato and either plant it directly or put it in water for another week to let the roots develop further. I usually start my slips indoors about 6 weeks before my last frost date. That gives me plenty of time to have strong, healthy slips ready to go in the ground once the soil warms up. One sweet potato can produce anywhere from 8 to 15 slips, so you really do not need many potatoes to get a good crop going. Now that we have our slips, let's talk about preparing your soil. And this right here is where most people go wrong. Sweet potatoes are not like tomatoes or peppers that love rich, heavily amended soil. In fact, if you plant sweet potatoes in soil that is too rich in nitrogen, you are going to get exactly what we talked about earlier, a massive vine with tiny tubers. So here is what you want: loose, well-draining soil that is low in nitrogen, but has adequate phosphorus and potassium. The phosphorus helps with root development, which is exactly what we want since tubers are modified roots. The potassium helps with the overall quality and size of the tubers. What you do not want is a bunch of nitrogen. That means no fresh compost, no manure, and definitely no high nitrogen fertilizers. I actually plant my sweet potatoes in a bed that I have not amended in a year or two, specifically because I want that nitrogen to be depleted. If your soil is heavy clay, you are going to need to loosen it up significantly. Sweet potatoes need to be able to push through the soil to form tubers, and if the soil is compacted or heavy, you will end up with small, misshapen tubers, or sometimes none at all. I like to work the soil down to about 12 inches deep and mix in some coarse sand if my soil is on the heavy side. Raised beds work really well for sweet potatoes because you can control the soil composition. If you are building a bed specifically for sweet potatoes, go with a mix of about 60% garden soil and 40% sand. Skip the compost entirely or use only a very small amount of well-aged compost. I know that sounds counterintuitive because we are always told to add compost, but trust me on this one. Sweet potatoes want lean soil. Another thing I do is create raised ridges or mounds for planting. I make rows that are about 8 to 10 inches tall and roughly 12 inches wide at the top. This gives the tubers room to expand and ensures excellent drainage. Waterlogged soil is a recipe for rotting tubers, so those raised ridges really help, especially if you get summer rain. Once your soil is prepared and the danger of frost has passed, it is time to plant your slips. Sweet potatoes are tropical plants and they do not tolerate cold at all. You want your soil temperature to be at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit before planting, and honestly 65 to 70 degrees is even better. In most areas that means waiting until about 2 to 3 weeks after your last frost date. When you are ready to plant, take your slip and bury it fairly deep. You want about half to 2/3 of the slip underground, with just a few leaves sticking out above the soil. I plant mine so that only the top 3 or 4 leaves are visible. All those buried nodes along the stem are going to produce roots and eventually tubers, so the more you bury, the better. Space your slips about 12 to 18 inches apart within the row. If you are doing multiple rows, keep them about 3 feet apart to give those vines room to spread. I know that seems like a lot of space, but sweet potato vines get big and they need room to sprawl. After planting, water your slips in well. This is the one time you want to be generous with water because the slips need to establish roots. Keep them consistently moist for the first week or two until you see new growth, which tells you the roots have taken hold. If you are finding this helpful so far, take a second to subscribe so you do not miss future videos. Now let's keep going. That brings us to watering, and this is another area where most gardeners get it wrong with sweet potatoes. Remember what I said earlier about stress? Once your slips are established, which takes about 2 weeks, you want to back off on the water significantly. Sweet potatoes are drought-tolerant plants, and overwatering is one of the main reasons people end up with all leaves and no tubers. Here is my approach. For the first 2 weeks after planting, I water regularly to help the slips establish. After that, I only water when the soil is dry down to about 2 inches. In most climates, that means watering deeply once a week, maybe twice during really hot spells. The goal is to let the soil dry out between waterings. When the soil is a little dry, the plant gets the message that it needs to store energy for harder times ahead, and it starts putting that energy into tubers instead of vines. Now, I am not saying you should let your plants wilt and suffer. If the leaves start drooping in the middle of the day, and they do not perk back up in the evening, that is too dry, and you need to water. But a little bit of mild water stress is actually a good thing. One more thing about watering. About 3 to 4 weeks before harvest, stop watering entirely if you can. This signals to the plant that the growing season is ending and encourages it to put every last bit of energy into those tubers. It also helps the skins toughen up, which makes them store better after harvest. Now let's talk about fertilizing, and honestly, this might be the shortest section of this whole video, because my main advice is do not do it. At least not the way you fertilize other vegetables. If you have been following along, you already know that nitrogen is the enemy of tuber production. And what do most fertilizers have a lot of? Nitrogen. So here is my rule. I do not fertilize my sweet potatoes at all during the growing season. The lean soil we prepared earlier is exactly what they need. If you absolutely feel like you need to give them something, and I understand that urge because we gardeners love to nurture our plants, then use a fertilizer that is low in nitrogen and higher in phosphorus and potassium. Look for something with a ratio like 5-10-10 or even 0-10-10. You could also side dress with a little wood ash, which provides potassium without adding nitrogen. But honestly, I have had my best sweet potato harvests in years, when I did absolutely nothing except plant them and let them grow. The more you baby them, the more leaves you get. The more you leave them alone, the more tubers you get. It took me a few years to learn that lesson, but once I did, my harvests improved dramatically. During the growing season, there is not a whole lot you need to do other than keep an eye on things. The vines are going to spread and sprawl all over the place, and that is completely fine. Some people recommend lifting the vines periodically to prevent them from rooting at the nodes as they spread across the ground. The theory is that if the vines root along their length, energy gets diverted away from the main tuber cluster. I have done it both ways, lifting the vines and leaving them alone, and honestly, I have not noticed a huge difference. But if you want to maximize your harvest and you have the time, go ahead and gently lift and move the vines every few weeks. Just do not break them because they are the pipeline that feeds energy back to those tubers. Keep an eye out for any weeds early in the season before the vines fill in. Once the sweet potato vines cover the ground, they do a pretty good job of shading out weeds on their own. In fact, that is one of the things I love about growing sweet potatoes. Once they get going, they are basically maintenance-free. Now let's talk about harvesting, because timing matters a lot more than most people realize. Sweet potatoes are ready to harvest when the leaves start to yellow and the vines begin dying back. In most areas, that happens about 90 to 120 days after planting, depending on your variety and growing conditions. But here is the thing. You can actually leave them in the ground longer if you want bigger tubers. The tubers keep growing and bulking up until the first frost. So if you have warm weather holding on, let them keep going. That said, you absolutely must harvest before a hard frost. A light frost that nips the leaves is fine. But if the cold gets down into the soil and freezes those tubers, they are ruined. They will start rotting almost immediately. So keep an eye on your weather forecast as fall approaches. When you are ready to harvest, use a garden fork or a broad fork and start digging about 12 to 18 inches away from the base of the plant. Go slow and work carefully because sweet potato skins are tender and they bruise easily. Any cuts or gouges you make during harvest become entry points for rot during storage. I like to use my hands for the final part, gently feeling around in the soil to find all the tubers without stabbing them with a fork. Work your way around the plant in a circle, loosening the soil and lifting gently. You will be amazed at how far from the main plant some of those tubers can be. I have found good-sized sweet potatoes almost 2 feet away from where I planted the slip. Once you have them all out of the ground, brush off the excess soil, but do not wash them. Washing removes the natural protective coating on the skin and shortens their storage life. Just brush them off and lay them out somewhere warm and dry. Let's talk about some common problems you might run into and how to solve them. The first one we have already covered extensively, and that is lots of vines but tiny tubers. If this is happening to you, it is almost always too much nitrogen or too much water. Next season, plant in leaner soil. Cut back on watering after establishment and do not fertilize. I promise you will see a difference. Second is cracked or misshapen tubers. This usually happens when watering is inconsistent, going from very dry to very wet and back again. It can also happen in heavy compacted soil where the tubers cannot expand evenly. Consistent light watering and loose, well-drained soil will prevent this. Third is tubers rotting in the ground before harvest. This is almost always a drainage problem. Sweet potatoes cannot sit in waterlogged soil. If you have heavy clay or poor drainage, grow them in raised beds or mounds next time. Also make sure you are not overwatering. Fourth is sweet potatoes that taste bland or starchy instead of sweet. This one is interesting because it is usually not a growing problem at all. It is a curing problem, which I am going to cover in the bonus tip. But if you have ruled that out, bland tubers can sometimes result from harvesting too early before the plant has had time to load those tubers with sugars. Fifth is critters eating your sweet potatoes before you can harvest them. Voles and mice are the usual culprits. They tunnel through the soil and feast on your tubers while they are still in the ground. If you have had this problem, try lining the bottom and sides of your planting bed with hardware cloth before filling with soil. It is extra work, but it keeps those rodents out. Sixth is slips that fail to establish and just wilt away. This usually means they did not have enough roots when you planted them, or the soil was too dry during that critical first week or two. Make sure your slips have visible roots before planting and keep them well watered until you see new growth. The good news is, sweet potatoes are generally pretty trouble-free once you get them established. Follow the steps we have covered, and you should avoid most of these issues entirely. Now for that bonus tip I promised you at the beginning, and this one is really important because it is the difference between sweet potatoes that taste starchy and bland versus sweet potatoes that are rich and caramelized and absolutely delicious. The secret is curing. Most people dig up their sweet potatoes and either eat them right away or throw them in storage. But freshly harvested sweet potatoes are not actually sweet. They are starchy. The sweetness develops during a curing process that converts those starches into sugars. Here is exactly how to do it. After harvest, place your sweet potatoes in a warm, humid location for about 10 to 14 days. You want temperatures around 80 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity around 80 to 90%. I know that sounds very specific, but you can create these conditions pretty easily. I use a small bathroom with a space heater and a tray of water to add humidity. Some people use a closet with a heat source. You can even put them in a covered box with a light bulb inside to generate heat and set a damp towel nearby for humidity. During this curing process, the starches convert to sugars and the skin toughens up for long-term storage. After curing, move your sweet potatoes to a cool, dry location around 55 to 60 degrees, and they will store for 6 months or more. And here is the really amazing part. They actually continue to get sweeter during storage. A sweet potato that has been stored for 2 or 3 months tastes dramatically better than one fresh out of the ground. So be patient, cure them properly, store them well, and you will be rewarded with the sweetest, most flavorful sweet potatoes you have ever tasted. So that is everything you need to know about growing sweet potatoes that actually produce big, beautiful tubers instead of just leaves. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you do not miss future videos. And if you have any questions or tips of your own, drop them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.